Have you ever loved someone so deeply, only to feel them slowly disappear right in front of you? No fight, no explanation, just distance, silence, coldness, and you're left questioning your worth, your effort, your heart. But what if I told you you weren't too much, you weren't the problem, you simply loved someone who didn't know how to receive it? And here's the truth they never expected you didn't break. You transformed, because they didn't just walk away from anyone, they walked away from an A10 empath who finally learned their power. What hurts the most is not the distance itself, it's the meaning you attach to it. When someone pulls away from you, especially after moments of closeness, your mind starts searching for answers. You replay conversations, analyze your words, question your tone, your timing, your emotions. You wonder if you were too intense, too available, too loving. You start shrinking yourself in your own thoughts, trying to find the exact moment where you lost them. But the truth is far less personal than it feels and far more revealing. When someone with avoidant tendencies begins to withdraw, it's not because you cross some invisible line of being too much. It's because the connection itself started to feel like too much for them to handle internally. Intimacy to them doesn't always feel safe or comforting. It can feel overwhelming, exposing, even threatening. Where you feel connection, they may feel pressure. Where you feel closeness, they may feel a loss of control. And that's where everything begins to shift. Because when they start to feel emotionally seen, when your presence becomes consistent, when your care becomes real and undeniable, it activates something deep inside them, not love in the way you understand it, but fear. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of what being close to you requires. Vulnerability, openness, emotional availability. These are not natural states for someone who has spent years, sometimes a lifetime, learning to rely only on themselves. So instead of leaning in, they lean out. They create space where there was once connection. They go silent where there was once communication. And from your side, it feels confusing, even painful, because nothing bad happened. There was no clear ending, no dramatic conflict, just a slow, quiet retreat. And that silence can feel louder than any argument. But here's the part most people don't understand: this reaction is not triggered by your flaws. It is triggered by your depth. The more genuine you are, the more emotionally present you become, the more it challenges someone who isn't used to operating in that space. You represent something real, something consistent, something they can't easily control or predict. And instead of adapting to that, they instinctively protect themselves from it. It's like standing in front of a mirror they never asked to look into. Because real connection doesn't just offer love, it also reflects truth. It exposes emotional patterns, unresolved wounds, and the parts of themselves they've learned to avoid. And for someone who has built their identity around independence and emotional distance, that reflection can feel uncomfortable. So they step back not because you're not enough, but because the connection asks them to become someone they don't yet know how to be. And while you're trying to understand them, trying to be patient, trying to give them space without losing yourself, you begin to carry the entire emotional weight of both people. You start adjusting, softening, overthinking, hoping that if you just find the right balance, they'll come back closer. But this isn't a problem you can solve with more love, because you cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You cannot prove your worth to someone who is disconnected from their ability to receive it. And you cannot build closeness with someone who equates intimacy with discomfort. The hardest realization is this: their distance is consistent with who they are, not a reaction to who you are. And once that truth settles in, something inside you begins to shift. You stop personalizing their withdrawal. You stop blaming your heart for being open. You begin to see that your willingness to connect deeply is not a weakness, it's a strength. It's something rare, and it deserves to be met, not managed. Because love is not supposed to feel like walking on emotional eggshells. It's not supposed to feel like you have to earn someone's presence by minimizing your own needs. Real connection doesn't require you to become less, it invites both people to become more. And when someone fears intimacy, they may never fully meet you there, not because you're asking for too much, but because they haven't learned how to exist in that space yet. So instead of asking, why wasn't I enough? The better question becomes, why am I trying to give so much to someone who is not ready to receive it? That question doesn't come from pain, yet comes from clarity. Because once you understand that their fear of closeness has nothing to do with your worth, You begin to release the need to chase their understanding. You stop trying to convince them of your value, and you start recognizing that the right connection will never require you to shrink your emotional depth to make someone else comfortable. You were never too much. You were simply standing in front of someone who wasn't ready for something real. There's a quiet pattern that many people don't even realize they're living in until it has already drained them, giving more, trying harder, showing up again and again, all in the hope that one day it will finally be enough to be chosen. It doesn't start as desperation. It starts as love. Pure, genuine, well-intentioned love. You see someone pulling away, and instead of stepping back, you lean in. You offer more understanding, more patience, more reassurance. You tell yourself that maybe they've just been hurt before. Maybe they just need time. Maybe if you stay consistent, they'll eventually feel safe enough to stay too. So you give. You give your attention when they become distant. You give your energy when they seem unsure. You give your presence even when yours isn't fully valued. And slowly, without realizing it, your love turns into effort, constant emotional effort to maintain something that should never feel this one-sided. The hardest part is that it doesn't feel wrong in the beginning. In fact, it feels meaningful. It feels like loyalty, like strength, like commitment. You convince yourself that this is what love looks like, that real love means not giving up, not walking away, not letting someone go just because they struggle to meet you where you are. But beneath that intention is something deeper that often goes unspoken, the desire to be chosen. Because every time they pull away and you move closer, there's a quiet hope inside you that this time they'll see you, that this time your effort will make them realize what they have, that this time they'll stop running and finally meet you halfway. And when they come back, even briefly, even with the smallest amount of attention, it feels like proof that what you're doing is working, so you keep going. But what you don't always see in the moment is how this pattern slowly begins to cost you parts of yourself. You start adjusting your expectations. You become more patient than you should have to be. You tolerate silence, inconsistency, emotional distance, things you would have never accepted before because you've invested so much already. You tell yourself that walking away now would mean all of it was for nothing, and that's where the trap deepens. Because the more you give, the more you attach your value to the outcome. You begin to measure your worth by how they respond to you. If they're warm, you feel secure. If they're distant, you feel anxious. Your emotional state starts depending on someone who is not emotionally consistent, and that creates a cycle that's incredibly hard to break. You start chasing not just the person, but the feeling they give you when they finally open up. That moment when they let their guard down, when they seem present, when they give you just enough to remind you why you stayed in the first place. And those moments, even if they're rare, feel powerful enough to keep you holding on. But love should not feel like a reward you have to earn. It should not feel like something that only shows up after you've proven your patience, your loyalty, your endurance. Real connection doesn't require you to exhaust yourself to be seen. It doesn't demand that you constantly pour into someone who isn't pouring back. And yet, empaths often find themselves in this exact position, overgiving, overextending, overinvesting because they feel deeply. They don't just connect on the surface. They see potential, they sense emotion, they understand pain. And because of that, they try to love people. Not just for who they are, but for who they believe they can become. But there's a dangerous line between loving someone and trying to heal them. Because when you start giving in the hope of being chosen, you're no longer standing in your own worth, you're negotiating it. You're saying, maybe if I do more, I'll be enough. But your worth was never meant to be proven through effort. It was meant to be recognized without conditions. And the truth is, the right person doesn't need to be convinced to choose you. They don't need repeated demonstrations of your value. They don't require you to sacrifice your emotional well-being just to keep their attention. They meet you with the same energy, the same presence, the same willingness to build something real. So when you find yourself constantly giving more than you're receiving, it's not a sign that you need to love harder. It's a sign that you need to pause and ask yourself why you're trying so hard to be chosen by someone who is unsure about choosing you at all. Because the moment you stop overgiving, something powerful happens. You begin to see things clearly. You notice the imbalance that you once ignored. You feel the space where your needs were never fully met. And instead of filling that space with more effort, You begin to fill it with awareness, with boundaries, with self-respect. You realize that love is not about losing yourself to keep someone else. It's about standing fully in who you are and allowing the right person to meet you there without you having to shrink, chase, or prove anything. And maybe the most important realization of all is this: you were never meant to earn love through exhaustion. You were meant to experience it through alignment. Because the moment you stop trying to be chosen by someone who cannot fully see you, you create space for something better, someone who doesn't just accept your love, but matches it without hesitation. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just fill the space. Between two people, it slowly starts to fill your mind. It's the silence that comes after connection, after moments that felt real, after conversations that made you believe something meaningful was building. And then, without warning, it fades. Messages slow down, energy shifts, presence disappears, and you're left sitting there, staring at your phone, replaying everything, trying to understand what changed. Because silence, when you care, never feels neutral. It feels like a message. You start translating that silence into meaning. Maybe they lost interest. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe you were too open, too expressive, too available. Your mind searches for a mistake because it feels easier to blame yourself than to accept that there may not be a clear explanation at all. And the more you sit in that silence, the louder those thoughts become. But what if that silence isn't about your failure? What if it has nothing to do with you falling short and everything to do with them not knowing how to stay present when things start to feel real? Because for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, silence is not just absence, it's a form of protection. When emotions begin to rise, when connection deepens beyond a certain point, they don't always know how to process it. It's unfamiliar territory. It requires vulnerability, consistency, and a level of emotional expression that they may not be comfortable with. So instead of leaning into it, they step away from it. And often they do it quietly. No explanation, no closure, just distance. Not because they want to hurt you, but because they don't know how to handle what they're feeling. Silence becomes their way of regaining control. It gives them space to avoid the discomfort of emotional responsibility. It allows them to disconnect without having to confront the impact of their withdrawal. But from your side, that silence can feel incredibly personal. It feels like rejection, like abandonment, like something you did push them away. And because there's no communication to clarify it, your mind fills in the gaps with self-doubt. You start questioning your worth, your behavior, your entire approach to the connection. You wonder why they couldn't just say something, why they couldn't communicate what they needed, why they left you to sit with unanswered questions instead of giving you clarity. And the absence of those answers can feel more painful than the truth itself, because silence takes room for interpretation, and when emotions are involved, those interpretations often lean towards self-blame. But here's the reality most people struggle to accept. Someone else's inability to communicate is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a reflection of their limitation. Communication requires emotional awareness. It requires the ability to recognize what you're feeling and the willingness to express it, even when it's uncomfortable. And not everyone has developed that ability. Some people have spent so long avoiding their emotions that when they finally encounter something real, they don't know how to respond in a healthy way. So they withdraw. They tell themselves they need space or time or distance, but what they're really doing is avoiding the internal discomfort that comes with being emotionally engaged. And instead of facing it, they choose silence because it feels easier. But easier for them often becomes painful for you, because you're left trying to make sense of something that was never clearly communicated. You're trying to find closure in a situation that was never properly addressed, and that creates a loop where you keep going back, mentally and emotionally, trying to resolve something that the other person never fully acknowledged. And that's where you have to shift your perspective, because waiting for someone who communicates through silence will keep you stuck in confusion. It will keep you analyzing, overthinking, and questioning yourself in ways that slowly erode your confidence. You begin to feel like you're asking for too much when all you wanted was clarity. You start to believe that your need for communication is a burden, when in reality, it's a basic requirement for any healthy connection. You are not wrong for wanting to understand where you stand. You are not wrong for expecting consistency, presence, and honesty. And you are certainly not wrong for feeling hurt when those things are replaced with silence. But, at some point, you have to stop interpreting silence as a puzzle to solve and start seeing it as information, because silence communicates something very clearly. This person is not showing up in a way that meets you where you are. It may not tell you why. It may not give you the answers you hope for. But it tells you enough to make a decision about what you deserve moving forward. And that decision is not about forcing them to speak. It's about choosing not to stay in a space where your emotional needs are ignored. Because real connection doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't leave you questioning your value or wondering if you did something wrong every time the other person pulls away. It provides clarity, even when it's uncomfortable. It creates understanding, even in difficult moments. And most importantly, it doesn't rely on silence as a substitute for honesty. So instead of asking, why aren't they talking to me? A more powerful question becomes, why am I still trying to understand someone who chooses not to communicate with me at all? That question brings you back to yourself. It shifts your focus away from their behavior and back toward your own standards. Because the moment you stop chasing explanations from someone who won't give them, you begin to reclaim your peace. You stop waiting for words that may never come, and you start listening to what their silence has already told you. At first, it doesn't feel like you're losing yourself. It feels like you're just trying a little harder, being a little more patient, giving a little more space. You tell yourself this is what understanding looks like. This is what love requires, sometimes adjusting, compromising, meeting someone where they are. And in healthy situations, that's true. But there's a quiet line that often gets crossed without you realizing at the moment, where effort turns into self-abandonment. Because every time they pulled away and you moved closer, something subtle began to happen inside you. You started prioritizing their comfort over your clarity, their pace over your needs, their silence over your voice. You began shaping your behavior around their reactions, trying to avoid anything that might make them withdraw again. You became more careful with your words, more controlled with your emotions, more tolerant of things that once didn't sit right with you. And slowly, you stopped showing up as your full self. You told yourself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, once they felt safe, once they understood how much you cared, everything would fall into place. So you kept adjusting. You kept softening your expectations. You convinced yourself that if you could just maintain the connection long enough, they would eventually meet you halfway. But here's what often goes unnoticed. The more you chase someone who is pulling away, the further you drift from yourself. Because chasing isn't just a physical or emotional pursuit, it's an internal thing. It's the constant thinking, analyzing, waiting, hoping. It's checking your phone more than usual. It's rereading messages, trying to find hidden meaning. It's silencing your own needs so you don't push them away. And all of that energy, all of that focus, is directed outward towards someone who is not giving you the same level of presence in return. So where does that leave you? Disconnected from yourself. You stop asking what you need. You stop honoring what you feel. You become so focused on maintaining the connection that you forget to question whether the connection is actually fulfilling you. And that's where the imbalance deepens, not just in the relationship, but within you. Because every time you ignore your own discomfort to keep someone else comfortable, you send yourself a message that your needs are secondary, that your feelings can wait, that your worth is tied to how well you can hold on to someone who is unsure about staying. And over time, that message starts to settle. You begin to accept less, not because you don't deserve more, but because you've conditioned yourself to tolerate it. You normalize inconsistency. You justify emotional distance. You explain away behaviors that once would have been clear signs to step back. And all of it is rooted in the same belief that, if you just hold on a little longer, things will change. But chasing someone who is emotionally unavailable doesn't bring you closer to them. It pulls you further away from yourself. Because, real connection doesn't require you to abandon your own center. It doesn't ask you to constantly adjust who you are, just to maintain someone else's presence. It doesn't leave you feeling like you have to earn consistency or prove your worth through patience alone. When you're chasing, you're not standing in your power, you're negotiating it. You're saying, I'll wait, I'll understand, I'll give more, even when you're not receiving what you truly need in return. And while that may come from a place of care, It creates a dynamic where your value becomes tied to your endurance rather than your authenticity. But here's the shift that changes everything. The moment you stop chasing, you start seeing clearly. You begin to notice how much you were carrying, how much effort you were putting into something that wasn't equally supported. You start to feel the weight of what you ignored, the uncertainty, the imbalance, the emotional strain, and instead of pushing those feelings aside, you allow yourself to acknowledge them. That awareness is not weakness. It's the beginning of self-return. Because when you stop running after someone, you create space to come back to yourself, to reconnect with your own needs, your own boundaries, your own sense of worth. You start asking different questions, not how do I keep them, but why am I holding on to something that cost me this much? And that question leads to clarity. You realize that love should not require you to shrink. It should not ask you to silence your voice or ignore your instincts. It should not leave you feeling uncertain about where you stand or whether you matter. You were never meant to chase love. You were meant to stand in it fully, confidently, without having to prove that you're worthy of receiving it. And the truth is, the right connection doesn't run when you show up as your full self. It doesn't pull away when things become real. It doesn't require you to abandon your own emotional needs just to keep it alive. So when you find yourself chasing, it's not a sign that you need to try harder. It's a sign that something is out of alignment. And the most powerful thing you can do in that moment is not to move closer but to pause, to step back, to reconnect with yourself before you lose even more of who you are trying to hold on to someone who isn't meeting you where you stand. Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself is the moment you start reclaiming your power. And from that place, everything changes. There comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable at first when something inside you shifts. It doesn't happen because they suddenly change. It doesn't come from a grand apology or a sudden realization on their part. It comes from you, from the exhaustion of trying, from the weight of carrying something that was never meant to be carried alone, from the repeated cycle of hope and disappointment that slowly teaches you a truth you can no longer ignore. You get tired, not just physically, but emotionally, tired of overthinking, tired of waiting, tired of hoping that this time will be different when every pattern has shown you otherwise. And that tiredness isn't weakness, that's awareness trying to break through. It's your mind and your heart finally aligning, telling you that what you've been accepting is not what you truly need. And in that space, something powerful begins to emerge. You start to see things without the filter of attachment. You notice how often you were the one out first, how often you were the one trying to fix the silence, to bridge the distance, to keep the connection alive. You begin to recognize the imbalance not in a blaming way, but in a clear, undeniable way. You realize that you've been pouring into something that hasn't been pouring back. And for the first time, instead of asking how to give more, you start asking why you've been giving so much. That question changes everything, because it turns your focus inward. It brings you back to yourself, the part of you that you slowly set aside while trying to maintain the connection. The part of you that had needs, boundaries, expectations that were quietly ignored in the process of understanding someone else. And as you reconnect with that part, you begin to feel something you may not have felt in a while: clarity. Clarity doesn't come with loud emotions. It doesn't rush in with anger or resentment. It comes with a calm understanding that settles deep within you. It tells you that you've done enough, that you've shown up, you've tried, you've given. And now it's time to step back, not out of frustration, but out of respect for yourself. This is the turning point. Not when they come back, not when they finally explain, but when you no longer need them to. Because something inside you has already answered the question you were waiting for them to respond to. You begin to detach, not in a cold or distant way, but in a grounded, self-aware way. You stop checking your phone with the same urgency. You stop analyzing every interaction. You stop building expectations around their behavior. And instead, you start rebuilding your connection with yourself. You remember what it feels like to be present without waiting, to enjoy your time without the background noise of uncertainty, to make decisions based on your own needs, not someone else's inconsistency. And that shift is quiet, but it's powerful, because the energy you once gave to chasing, to fixing, to understanding now starts returning to you. You invested in your own growth, your own peace, your own sense of stability. You begin to set boundaries not as a reaction to them, but as a reflection of your standards. You recognize that your time, your energy, your emotional availability are valuable and they deserve to be shared with someone who can meet you with the same level of presence. And the more you stand in that understanding, the less appealing the old pattern becomes. You no longer feel the urge to go back and explain yourself. You no longer feel the need to prove your worth or remind them of what you offered, because you've already seen it clearly, and once you see something clearly, it's hard to unsee it. You begin to understand that closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from realization, from recognizing that what you were holding on to was not aligned with what you truly need, from accepting that not every connection is meant to be completed. Some are meant to teach you, to reveal something about yourself, and then let you move forward with that understanding. And as you move forward, something else begins to happen. You regain your sense of control, not control over them or over the situation, but over yourself, over your choices, your responses, your direction. You stop reacting to their behavior and start responding to your own truth. You choose peace over confusion, stability over uncertainty, clarity over mixed signals. And in that space, you don't feel empty. You feel stronger, because you didn't just walk away from a person, you walked away from a pattern that was slowly disconnecting you from who you are. You chose yourself, and that choice is not loud. It doesn't need validation or recognition. It's internal. It's steady. It's the kind of strength that doesn't come from fighting, but from finally letting go of what no longer aligns. And here's the part they never expect. When you stop chasing, when you stop overgiving, when you stop trying to hold on to something that isn't fully holding on to you, you become different. Not hardened, not closed off, but grounded, clear, centered. You're no longer driven by the need to be chosen. You become someone who chooses where to invest your energy, chooses who gets access to your time, chooses connections that feel mutual, consistent, and real. And from that place, your presence changes. You're not seeking attention, you're offering alignment. You're not asking for clarity or embodying it. You're not trying to be enough, you know that you already are. And that is the moment everything shifts. Because the empath didn't break. The empath woke up. At some point, the story stops being about what they did and starts becoming about what you discovered. In the beginning, it felt like loss. Like something meaningful slipped through your hands without warning. You looked back at the connection, the moments, the effort, and you couldn't understand how something that felt so real could end in distance. It felt unfinished, unresolved. And for a while, you carried that weight, the confusion, the questions, the quiet disappointment of not being chosen the way you had chosen them. But time, when combined with awareness, has a way of shifting perspective. Because as you step further away from the situation, as the emotional intensity begins to settle, you start to see things with more clarity. You begin to understand not just what happened, but what it revealed. And what it revealed wasn't your weakness, it was your capacity, your ability to care deeply, to show up consistently, to invest emotionally in something you believed in. Those qualities didn't disappear just because the connection didn't last. They didn't lose value just because they weren't fully received. If anything, they became more visible. And that's where the realization begins to take shape. They didn't walk away from someone ordinary. They walked away from someone who had the ability to understand them, to support them, to create something real. Someone who was willing to meet them with patience, with presence, with depth. And while they may not have recognized that in the moment, it doesn't change the truth of what you brought into that space. But here's the important part. This is not about proving that they lost something valuable. It's about recognizing that you are something valuable. Because when you focus only on what they lost, still tying your worth to their awareness, you're still measuring your value based on whether or not they realize it. And true growth doesn't come from being acknowledged by someone else, it comes from acknowledging yourself. It comes from seeing clearly what you offered, not through the lens of rejection, but through the lens of truth. You showed up, you gave, you stayed present even when things became uncertain. And while that may not have been matched in the way you hoped, it doesn't make it any less real. It doesn't reduce its significance. It simply means it was given in a space that couldn't fully hold it. And that's a reflection of capacity, not worth. Because not everyone has the emotional depth to receive what you naturally give. Not everyone is prepared to handle consistency, vulnerability, and genuine connection. Some people are still navigating their own internal patterns, their own fears, their own limitations. And when they encounter something real, something steady, something that asks them to step outside of those patterns, they don't always rise to meet it. Sometimes they retreat, not because it lacks value, but because it requires growth. And growth for many is uncomfortable. So instead of meeting the moment, they move away from it. They leave behind something that could have been meaningful, not because it wasn't right, but because they weren't ready. And understanding that changes everything, because it allows you to release the idea that you were lacking. It helps you let go of the belief that if you had done something differently, the outcome would have changed. It shifts your focus away from trying to rewrite the past and toward accepting what it showed you. It showed you your strength, not the kind of strength that comes from holding on, but the kind that comes from letting go when something is no longer aligned, the kind that allows you to walk away without needing closure from the other person, the kind that trusts your own experience enough to move forward without constant validation. And as you step into that understanding, something inside you stabilizes. You stop looking back with the same intensity. You stop replaying scenarios, trying to find different endings. You begin to accept that not every connection is meant to stand. That doesn't make it a failure. Some connections are meant to reveal, to teach, to redirect. They show you what you're capable of giving. They show you what you need in return. And times, they show you what you've been willing to tolerate that no longer aligns with who you're becoming. Because growth isn't just about gaining something new, it's about outgrowing what no longer fits. And when you outgrow a dynamic that once held your attention, your energy naturally shifts. You begin to invest in things that bring you stability, clarity, and peace. You become more intentional with your time, more aware of your boundaries, more selective about where you place your emotional energy. You stop pouring into spaces that feel uncertain. You start choosing connections that feel mutual. And in that shift, you don't feel like you've lost something. You feel like you've returned to yourself, stronger, clearer, more grounded than before. Because the experience didn't break you, it refined you. It showed you the depth of your own heart, the resilience of your own spirit, the importance of your own standards. It reminded you that your ability to love is not something to question, it's something to protect. And the next time you encounter a connection, you don't enter it from a place of proving. You enter it from a place of knowing what you bring, knowing what you deserve, knowing that the right person won't require you to diminish your depth to make them comfortable. They will meet you in it. And until that happens, you are no longer waiting. You are living, growing, evolving, fully aligned with yourself. Because in the end, they didn't break you. They revealed you.